The knife was already at Isadora Westbrook's throat before she understood that the man holding it was not in any meaningful sense of the word a man at all. "Tell me where he sleeps." The voice behind her was silk wrapped around gravel, and the blade pressed just firmly enough against her pulse point to remind her that her heart was still beating, that blood still moved through her veins, that she was extraordinarily, terrifyingly mortal. "Tell me where Corvin Mordaine rests during daylight, and I will let you walk out of this gallery alive." Isadora did not scream. She had learned, in the 3 weeks since her life had been irrevocably altered, that screaming accomplished nothing in rooms where the predators were faster than sound. Instead, she kept her breathing measured and her eyes fixed on the enormous oil painting directly ahead of her, a portrait of a pale-skinned, white-haired man with silver eyes that looked almost alive, even rendered in centuries-old pigment, and she said, very clearly, "No." The blade pressed harder. "You are a human heiress playing at court politics, little Westbrook. You are not equipped for what happens next." "I am equipped," Isadora said, "to know that you will kill me whether I answer or not, because I have already seen your face. So the blade is a prop, and your real leverage died the moment you showed it to me." She paused. "Also, Corvin is going to find you, and when he does, you are genuinely going to wish you had chosen a different profession." A sound came from the darkness at the far end of the gallery, low and unhurried, like thunder deciding whether to bother with lightning. "She is not wrong," said Corvin Mordaine, and his voice alone dropped the temperature of the room by what felt like 10 degrees. He moved from shadow into the cold blue light of the gallery's skylight, and he was, as he always was, breathtaking in a way that had nothing to do with warmth or softness. White hair falling to his collarbones, skin so pale it looked carved from marble, silver eyes that held 8 centuries of banked fury behind their surface calm. He wore a black coat that cost more than most cars, and he moved the way old power always moved, like the world was expected to get out of his way, and usually did. The blade disappeared from Isadora's throat before she had time to process it. The man who had been holding it was across the room and pinned against the wall, 7 feet off the floor, Corvin's hand at his collar, his feet cycling uselessly in the air. "You touched her," Corvin said, and those 2 words carried the entire compressed weight of a blood law violation, an ancient vow broken, a line crossed that could not be uncrossed. "She is a human. She has no protection under the covenant. She is under my protection," Corvin said, "which supersedes the covenant, the council, and every other authority you believe yourself answerable to." The man's face was going purple. Isadora, her hand moving instinctively to her throat where the blade had rested, watched Corvin hold this creature suspended with one hand and absolutely no visible effort, and she felt the complicated mixture of awe and frustration that had defined every day of the past 3 weeks. Awe, because he was extraordinary. Frustration, because extraordinary men who had lived for 8 centuries tended to believe that the humans they cared about were ornamental rather than operational. "Corvin," she said, "we need him talking, not dead." A pause. Those silver eyes cut to her, cool and measuring, and something else that he would never name out loud. "He put a blade to your throat, and I handled it. I need to know who sent him." She crossed her arms. "Please do not kill him yet." Corvin held the man suspended for another 3 seconds, purely, she suspected, to make a point about whose timeline mattered. Then he lowered him, slowly, with the kind of controlled strength that was almost more frightening than speed, and said, "You have 2 minutes to tell her everything she wants to know. Then I reassess." The name the man gave them, between ragged breaths and a great deal of convincing, was one that made Isadora's stomach drop straight through the marble floor. Veltharion. She had heard that name exactly once before, spoken in a hushed, almost reverent tone by Corvin's oldest ally, a vampire named Serenia who wore her dark century-like jewelry and treated fear as a social currency. Veltharion was old, Serenia had said, older than most courts, older than most blood laws, old in the way that things became dangerous when they had outlasted every consequence they were supposed to fear, and apparently he wanted Corvin dead. The how and why of that required context that took Isadora back, mentally, to the beginning, to the night 3 weeks ago, when her world had cracked open and let the dark in. She had been standing in a boardroom at 11 in the evening, which was not unusual for an heiress managing a $2 billion estate left in administrative chaos by a father who had turned out to have extraordinary debts and even more extraordinary enemies. The Westbrook name still opened doors, but it had stopped being a guarantee, and Isadora had spent the better part of 6 months learning the difference between doors that opened out of respect and doors that opened out of opportunity. The men in the boardroom that night had been the second kind. They had presented her with papers, a hostile acquisition, framed as partnership, structured in ways that would have transferred controlling interest in Westbrook Holdings to a shell company that she had traced, through 4 layers of corporate veiling, to something called the Noctua Collective. She had asked politely for 3 days to review. They had told her less politely that the window was 24 hours. She had gathered her files, her dignity, and her coat, and she had walked out of the building into a November night that was cold enough to hurt. She had been followed from the parking structure, not subtly. 2 men, moving with a coordination and silence that struck her, even then as wrong in some fundamental biological way. She had made it 4 blocks before the alleyway happened, before the hands that grabbed her were too strong and too cold and too fast, and before the thing that pulled those hands off her arrived like a controlled detonation. Corvin Mordaine had killed both of them with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a task he found mildly tedious. Then he had looked at her, her back against a brick wall, her breath coming in visible clouds, and said, with an expression that was somewhere between aristocratic assessment and reluctant concern, "You are Isadora Westbrook." "I am," she had said. "You have made a significant enemy in the past several hours. The Noctua Collective is not a corporate entity. It is a vampire court, and the men you refused to sign papers for were not acting in any legal capacity you would recognize." She had stared at him. She had stared for a very long time. He had waited with the patience of someone who was accustomed to giving people time to catch up. "Vampires," she had said finally. "Yes, are real, demonstrably. And they want my company. They want what is beneath your company," he had said. The Westbrook estate sits on one of the oldest ley lines on the eastern seaboard. The building above it is irrelevant. What is below it is not. She had not gone home that night. She had not gone home for 3 days, because within 24 hours it had become apparent that her apartment was being watched, that her assistant had been approached, and that the Noctua Collective had decided that the fastest path to what they wanted ran directly through her. Corvin had installed her in a suite in a building that looked like a converted textile warehouse from the outside, and was, on the inside, something between a palace and a fortress, all dark wood paneling and high ceilings and art that belonged in museums. He had explained, over the course of several evenings, the architecture of the world she had stumbled into. The vampire courts were old structures that operated in parallel to human institutions, using the same cities, the same financial networks, the same communication channels, but layered beneath them, invisible to the unaware. The Covenant was the body of blood laws that governed how vampire courts interacted with each other and with the human world. It prohibited direct interference in human affairs except under specific licensed circumstances. It prohibited violence against humans under formal protection. It prohibited, above all, the use of ley lines for anything outside the explicitly ratified ritual calendar. The Noctua Collective, led by Veltharion, had been pushing against every one of those prohibitions for the better part of a decade. They were patient, as old things intended to be patient, and they were building towards something that Corvin's intelligence network had not yet fully mapped. What they had mapped was that Corvin Mordaine was the primary obstacle. She had eventually pieced together the closest thing the vampire world had to a regent without portfolio, a position that had no formal title but enormous practical authority. 800 years old, a member of 3 different covenant drafting bodies, the holder of bloodline alliances that connected him to courts on 4 continents. He did not rule. He had declined every formal rule that had been offered to him over the centuries, which, he explained without elaboration, had been several. But he enforced, he adjudicated. He showed up when things went wrong, and his showing up was usually enough. The Noctua Collective needed him gone. Isadora had listened to all of this with her full attention, which was the most valuable thing she possessed. and she had asked the questions that needed asking. Why was he helping her? What did he want in exchange? What was the exit condition, the point at which she could return to her life? He had answered the first two questions with more honesty than she had expected. He was helping her because the collective's interest in the Westbrookley line represented the kind of escalation that could not be ignored, and because she was a civilian who had walked into a conflict she had no way of having anticipated. He wanted nothing in exchange. He was entirely clear on that point, in a way that was almost as aggressive, as if the idea of owing something was something he needed to preemptively refuse. The third question he had not answered directly. She had noticed that. She had filed it. Over the following weeks, the dynamic between them had become something that she could not have described in any neat vocabulary. He was protective in ways that were sometimes overbearing and always genuine. He set boundaries, not restrictions. He had clarified once with some irritation when she pushed back, but boundaries between what he could keep her safe from and what he could not. He did not lie to her. This, she came to understand, was not a courtesy he extended widely. She was not passive in any of this. She had spent the first week mapping the Noctua collective's corporate shell structure from the inside, using the same forensic accounting methods she had used to untangle her father's estate, and she had found three things that Corvin's network had missed. He had looked at her documentation with an expression she could only describe as recalibrating, the expression of someone updating a model that had been operating on incomplete data. "You are not what I expected," he had said. "Most people aren't," she had replied, "when you start by underestimating them." He had not done it again. The trust between them had built the way trust actually builds, not through declarations or grand gestures, but through accumulated evidence. He trusted her instincts in boardrooms, and she trusted his read of court politics. He kept her informed of every development that affected her safety, and she kept him informed of every financial thread she pulled. They argued, sometimes sharply, about strategy and risk, and the question of when her involvement crossed from asset to liability, a framing she objected to every time he used it. Because she was not a liability, she was a participant, and there was a difference he seemed genuinely to struggle with, but underneath the arguments something else was accumulating. She noticed it first in the way he positioned himself in rooms, always between her and the door, always with his back to the wall, so that his field of vision covered every entrance. She noticed it in the way he spoke to the members of his court when she was present, a subtle shift in register that communicated, without a word directed at her, that she was not to be discussed in certain tones. She noticed it in the moments between conversations, when he looked at her and then looked away with the practiced deliberateness of someone who had decided not to do something and was maintaining that undecision considerable internal pressure. She was not oblivious. She had never been oblivious. But she understood, in a way that she thought perhaps he did not, how large the distance was between noticing something and knowing what to do with it. He was 800 years old. He had watched everything he had ever loved either die or transform beyond recognition. He had built himself into something that did not lose things, because the most reliable way to not lose things was to not hold them. She had seen enough of his dark past in the stories Serenia told, in the careful omissions of his own accounts, to understand that what lived behind those silver eyes was not coldness. It was grief that had been running for so long it had learned to move like calculation. She had not said any of this to him. She was waiting for the right moment, or possibly for him to be the one who said it first, or possibly for a crisis to make the choice for both of them. The crisis, as it happened, was already in motion. The man from the gallery, after considerable persuasion that Isadora chose not to watch closely, confirmed what the financial documentation had been suggesting for the past week. Veltharion was not waiting for the next Covenant calendar window. He was moving now. He had a ritual Rome framework assembled, practitioners gathered, and a timeline that ran to the full moon in 4 days, which gave him a window to activate the ley line beneath the Westbrook estate, before any formal objection could be brought to the Covenant body. There was a complication. The ritual required a human anchor, someone with a bloodline connected to the ley line's historical binding. The Westbrook family had lived on that land for 6 generations. The binding was old, older than the family itself. but the bloodline had become wound into it over time in a way that meant activation without consent would be catastrophically unstable, which was why the collective had initially tried to get her signature on papers, a legal transfer that under old blood law would have functioned as a form of consent. When that failed, they had shifted strategies. They no longer needed her signature. They needed her present at the site when the ritual began, and they needed her alive, at least until the binding took hold. After that, they did not need her at all. Corvin heard this and went very still in the way that she had learned was far more dangerous than any visible anger. It was the stillness of something ancient deciding on a course of action, and the decision being made was absolute. "We will need to go to the council," he said. "The Covenant Council takes 3 weeks to convene an emergency session." Serenia said. She had arrived, as she often did, without announcement, materializing from a corner of the gallery that Isadora would have sworn was empty 10 seconds ago. "We have 4 days, then we go to the individual seats. I hold proxies for 6 Covenant members. With 6 proxies, I can call a blood law injunction without full convening. Veltharion will contest it. Let him contest it. An injunction buys us time and forces him to act openly rather than through proxies." Corvin's eyes moved to Isadora. "You will go somewhere secure while this—" "No," she said. The word sat in the gallery air with considerable confidence. "Isadora." His voice carried the specific weight of someone who had made a decision and was finding it not accepted. "The injunction will only hold if I file a formal human rights claim under the Covenant's Civilian Protection Statute." I looked it up. There is a clause that allows a human with documented ley line heritage to file directly with the council rather than going through a court representative. I can do that. A human filing carries more procedural weight than a proxy injunction because it triggers a different review body, one that Veltharion does not have the same influence over. Silence. Serenia made a sound that might have been approval. Corvin looked at her with that recalibrating expression, and then, slowly he said, "You have been reading Covenant law. For the past 11 days, you have a very good library. The filing requires you to appear in person before the civilian review seat. That is in the lower court, beneath the city. Then I will go beneath the city. It is not safe for a human. Yes, I understand. I have heard the sentence before, and I am still not interested in finishing it." She faced him fully, and she was aware that she was a 5'6" human woman facing 8 centuries of vampire authority, and she did not care. "I am the one Veltharion wants. My signature was the thing he tried to acquire legally. My presence is the thing he is going to try to acquire by force. That makes me the person with the most leverage in this proceeding, and sending me somewhere safe and away from the process takes that leverage off the table." She paused. "You know I am right. I can see you thinking about it." Serenia very quietly said, "She is right." Corvin said nothing for a long moment. Then he closed the distance between himself and Isadora in a single step, and he was close enough that she could see the way the gallery light fractured in his silver eyes, and he said, low and direct, "If anything happens to you in that court, I will burn the Covenant to the ground. I want you to know that before you make this choice, because it is not an empty statement and the consequences of it would be significant." Her breath did something complicated. She kept her expression steady. "Then, let us make sure nothing happens to me." The entrance to the lower court was accessed through a private banking building in the financial district, through a vault corridor that predated the building by 400 years, down stairs carved from living bedrock, into a city that existed in negative space beneath the city everyone else knew. Isadora had imagined something gothic and dusty. What she found was an architecture of dark elegance, vaulted ceilings lit by arrangements of blue-white light that resembled electricity but moved like flame, corridors of polished black stone, figures in formal dress, moving with the unhurried gravity of entities that had nowhere they needed to be quickly. Every head turned when Corvin Mordaine walked in, not toward him. They were already tracking him. The turning was toward her. She was the only human in the lower court, and she was walking beside the most authoritative figure in it, and the mathematics of that combination produced visible reactions in everyone they passed, ranging from fascination to calculation to something that read uncomfortably like hunger, though no one moved toward her. No one would, she suspected, while Corvin was within arm's reach. He walked with his hand, not quite touching, the small of her back, a fraction of an inch away, close enough that she could feel the cool intention of it without the actual contact. And she understood that this was deliberate. A statement made in the physical grammar of a world with different conventions. She is here, she is with me. Reconsider your options. The civilian review seat was a chamber that looked more like an amphitheater than a courtroom. Tiered seating, rising on 3 sides, and a central floor of stone inlaid with the Covenant seal in what appeared to be actual silver. The reviewing arbiter was a vampire called Thessaly, ancient and androgynous, and wrapped in bureaucratic authority like a second skin. They looked at Isadora with a specific expression of someone encountering a precedent they had not anticipated. A living Westbrook, Thessaly said. The last time a human filed directly with this body was in 1887. I trust the procedure has not changed, Isadora said. It has not. Thessaly studied her. You understand that filing here places you formally within the Covenant's legal jurisdiction for the duration of the proceedings. I understand, and you understand that within this jurisdiction, my protection statute supersedes any claim the Noctua Collective currently holds. That is precisely why I am here. Something shifted in Thessaly's expression, a thawing, or possibly a recognition. File your claim, Miss Westbrook. She filed it. She had the documentation, prepared, printed, tabbed, cross-referenced, because she was who she was, and she had never walked into a proceeding unprepared. Thessaly reviewed it with impressive speed and declared a formal review period of 48 hours, which put the proceedings squarely before Veltharion's 4-day window and produced exactly the legal complication that Corvin had been looking for. Except that Veltharion, as they discovered within the hour, had anticipated this. Serenia arrived in the lower court through a side passage with the expression she wore when she was delivering news that required preparation. She pulled Corvin aside. Bakor, Isadora moved with him because she had decided some time ago that being excluded from conversations about her own survival was not something she would accept. Serenia looked at her, then at Corvin, then back at her, and apparently decided to save the argument the trouble. Veltharion has a counterfiling. He has documented evidence that the Westbrook ley line binding was formally transferred to a collective subsidiary in 2019 via a contract signed by Edmund Westbrook. Isadora went cold. Edmund Westbrook was her father. That is not possible, she said, and even as she said it, the forensic accountant's part of her brain was already running backward through her father's files, through the extraordinary debts and extraordinary enemies, through the shell companies and the offshore structures, looking for the seam. I need to see that document, she said. Veltharion will not produce it without. Then we subpoena it through the review process. Thessaly has jurisdiction. File for document production. She looked at Corvin. My father was approached by the collective before I was. Whatever he signed under conditions that we can challenge. If there was coercion, duress, or if he signed without full knowledge of what he was transferring, the contract is void under both human commercial law and covenant blood law. She paused. I know my father. He did not understand what they were asking him for. He understood money and debt and desperation, and they used those things. Corvin was watching her with an expression she had not seen before. It was not the recalibrating look, and it was not the fierce protective calculation that she was accustomed to. It was something quieter and more unguarded, and it was there and gone in a moment, tucked back behind the silver's composure. File for document production, he told Serenia. Serenia filed. Thessaly granted it. Veltharion, via his court representative, a vampire called Mordecai Vex, who wore contempt like a cravat, objected in terms that made clear the collective had not expected this level of procedural competence from a human plaintiff. Good, Isadora thought. Underestimate me. Everyone who has done it has regretted it. The document production order gave them 12 hours, and Corvin used those hours to do something he rarely did. He came to her rooms in the lower court's residential wing, where she had been given quarters that were elegant and comfortable and slightly too quiet, and he sat in the chair across from her and did not for a long moment say anything. She waited. Your father, he said finally. He met with collective representatives in 2018. I knew about that meeting. I chose not to intervene because the collective at that stage had not crossed any covenant line, and intervention without cause would have violated my own authority structure. She looked at him. I am telling you this because I want you to have the complete information. If I had intervened, the contract may never have been signed. I did not, and I have carried that since the night I found you in that alley. He held her gaze directly, which was not something he always did, because direct eye contact in vampire culture had implications that could be either intimate or aggressive, depending on context. With her, he was always careful about it. Right now, he was choosing it deliberately. I am sorry. Isadora absorbed this. She took the full weight of it, the might have been, the chain of causation, the life her father had lived in the 2 years before his death that she had understood in financial terms, but not in this context. She turned it over. She let herself feel what it produced, which was grief, old and familiar, and not, she found, anger directed at the man across from her. You could not intervene in every human interaction with the collective, she said. The collective is large. You are one person. I am a very old, very well-resourced person with an intelligence network that existed specifically to monitor threats of this kind. And you made a judgment call and it did not produce the outcome you would have wanted. That is not the same as causing what happened. She leaned forward, elbows on knees. Corvin, you did not put the blade to my father's throat. Veltharion did. The distinction matters. He was looking at her the way he looked at paintings in his gallery, with a particular quality of attention that felt like trying to understand something through prolonged, honest observation. You are remarkably ungiven to assigning blame. I assign blame where it belongs. It belongs on Veltharion. She paused. And if you had been watching my father in 2018, you found me in that alley 3 weeks ago in a city of 8 million people in about 4 minutes, which means you have been watching me. A beat, yes, he said. For how long? Another beat shorter. Since your father's death, I was aware that the collective might see you as a leverage point. I established surveillance as a precaution. And when the attack happened, you were already close enough to intervene. Yes, she considered this. You could have introduced yourself sooner. You could have warned me. I considered it. I concluded that informing a human heiress with no prior knowledge of our world, that the holding company after her family estate was actually a vampire court would produce one of 2 outcomes. Either disbelief, which would leave her unprotected, or credence combined with panic, which would alert the collective that she had been warned. He paused. I was wrong to wait as long as I did. The attack was closer than I had anticipated because the collective moved faster than my timeline estimated. You are admitting to 2 miscalculations in one conversation, she said. That must be uncomfortable for you. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the near approach of one, which on his face was more expressive than a full smile on almost anyone else's. It is a newer practice. I like it, she said simply. The quiet that followed was different from the earlier quiet. It was full rather than empty, the kind of silence that contained things that had not yet found their words. She did not push. She had the instinct to, because she was someone who solved problems by moving toward them. And Corvin Mordaine was as a problem of the best and most complicated kind. But some things needed their own time, and she had learned that patience was not the same as passivity. The document production revealed what she had suspected. Her father's signature was on a contract from 2019, but the contract was written in a mixture of human, corporate language and covenant blood law that no human attorney would have been able at tasks, and it had been executed under conditions of what the filing clearly documented as financial duress. Edmund Westbrook had been told he was signing a mineral rights transfer. He had not been told he was binding a ley line anchor into a collective sub-entity. The contract was fraudulent under human law, and, as Isadora argued before Thessaly the following morning with documentation she had been assembling since 3 a.m, coercive under Covenant Blood Law's clause on informed consent for binding transfers, Thessaly reviewed. Thessaly deliberated with the speed of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and recognized a clean case when it was laid in front of them. Thessaly voided the contract. The chamber was full when the ruling was read. Veltharion's representative Mordecai Vex made an objection so ornate and so clearly stalling that Thessaly shut it down in 4 sentences. Isadora stood at the center floor, on the covenant seal inlaid in silver, and she was aware of the weight of the room around her, the age of it, the density of politics and history, and accumulated power, and she was not afraid of it. She was the rightful heir to a 6th-generation bond with a ley line. She had the documentation, she had the law, and she had made her argument. She won. But winning in the lower court and winning in the world outside it were 2 different things, and Veltharion, she was about to discover, was not bound by procedural defeats. The ambush came as they were leaving the court through the vault corridor. Not the gentle corridor of banking architecture, but the older passage, the bedrock stairs, where Corvin and Serenia and 2 members of his court guard were moving her back toward the surface. Veltharion had sent 12 vampires, old ones, with the particular stillness that distinguished age from youth in their kind, filling the corridor in both directions. Isadora registered the trap in the same breath that Corvin's arm came across in front of her, pressing her back against the stone wall, his body between her and the nearer group of 6. Veltharion, Corvin said, and the name in his mouth was not a greeting. It was a classification. The figure at the front of the nearer group was tall, thin in the way that old things sometimes became thin, like they had burned all excess away over the centuries, with white hair worn long and loose and eyes the color of dried blood. He was beautiful in the way that certain predators were beautiful, abstractly and at a distance. Mordaine, Veltharion said, you have been a problem for a very long time. I consider that a positive assessment, the civilian review ruling, will be appealed. You know this. It will be in committee for years, and in the meantime, my timeline does not pause. Veltharion's gaze moved to Isadora, past Corvin's shoulder, with the specific quality of someone looking at a component rather than a person. Give me the woman and take your court home. No one needs to die tonight. I have a different proposal, Corvin said. Leave this corridor. Leave this city. Withdraw your court's filing with the appeal body, and I will extend you the courtesy of not bringing the full weight of 6 Covenant proxy votes and 3 bloodline alliances down on your infrastructure before the end of the week. Veltharion smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been patient for a very long time and had decided their patience was about to pay out. You are attached to her, he said. I wondered if you would let that happen. You have been careful for so long. 8 centuries of not letting anything in. He tilted his head. It makes you predictable. Kill her and your leverage disappears. Kill her and you become something other than the controlled, law-abiding regent without portfolio, do you not? You become grief again, and grief does not sit on covenant councils. Corvin said nothing. Isadora felt the silence like a physical pressure. He is trying to make you react, she said quietly, for Corvin alone. He wants you to move first so he can claim self-defense in the appeal. Another of those recalibrating pauses. Then Corvin said, low and private, I know, then do not move. I have an idea. She had been thinking since they entered the corridor. She had been cataloguing. 12 opponents, a sealed stone passage with 2 exits, a covenant ruling fresh from the chamber, and 1 very specific legal instrument she had not yet deployed. Veltharion, she said, stepping slightly to the side, so she was visible past Corvin's arm. He shifted immediately to compensate, which she had anticipated, and she spoke over his shoulder before he could object. You need me present at the ley line to complete the ritual. Without me, you have the site but not the anchor, because my father's contract has been voided and the binding reverted to my bloodline. Veltharion regarded her with something that might have been curiosity. Yes, then you need me alive and unharmed, which means this corridor is a standoff, not an ambush. You cannot touch me without destroying the anchor, and Corvin cannot respond to a threat that is not yet in action without violating covenant law himself. She kept her voice even. So we are all standing here having a conversation that benefits no one. Unless, Veltharion said, and now his curiosity sharpened into something else. You come with me willingly, under formal protective custody. I can offer you a guarantee of safety under my court's blood law if you... No, Corvin said, and the word was not a refusal. It was a door closing in stone. You were asking her while standing between her and the only exits in a sealed corridor with 11 armed members of your court. That is not an offer of safety. That is a threat wearing different clothes. Corvin's voice had not risen. It was perfectly glacially level, and somehow that was worse. You will not speak to her as though she has options here that I am preventing her from taking. She has every option, she does not want yours. He was looking at Veltharion, but the statement was for her, and she understood it as such. She was not trapped, she was choosing to stand here. The difference mattered to him, and she found that she was abruptly and overwhelmingly moved by that. I have a formal counteroffer, she said. Under Covenant Statute, Clause 37 of the Civilian Protection Code, a human with documented leyline heritage can offer voluntary managed transfer of binding rights to a court of their choosing in exchange for full protective designation. I am exercising that clause. I am designating Corvin Mordaine's court as the receiving body of a voluntary binding transfer, effective immediately, witnessed in this corridor under the Covenant's implied witness rule, which is valid in any space within 300 feet of a Covenant seal. She looked at Veltharion steadily. The ley line anchor is now housed in a Covenant-protected court structure. Your ritual window is closed permanently. Silence. Veltharion stood very still. That clause, he said slowly, requires the designated court to accept the transfer. Isadora looked at Corvin. He turned to look at her, and for a moment it was just the two of them in this stone corridor. The rest of the world going quiet around the edges, and she watched him understand all of it, not just the legal mechanism, but what the mechanism meant, what accepting it would mean, what she was asking and offering in the same breath. I accept, Corvin said, and his voice for the first time in 3 weeks had something in it that was not controlled at all. The Covenant's implied witness rule was, as Isadora had correctly identified, valid within 300 feet of a formal seal, and they were standing approximately 140 feet from the chamber where she had won her ruling that morning. The transfer was legally instantaneous. Veltharion's timeline did not close slowly. It collapsed. The 12 figures in the corridor went from predatory stillness to something else, a reading of the situation that produced, in those who were old enough to recognize an unrecoverable position, a studied neutrality. Not retreat, not yet. But the specific posture of people deciding whether the next move was worth its cost. Veltharion looked at Isadora for a long time. He looked at her the way things looked when they encountered an outcome they had not modeled and were not sure how to categorize. 8 centuries, he said to Corvin, and you let a human girl outmaneuver me in a corridor. She outmaneuvered you, Corvin said. I simply agreed with her strategy. You let her in. Veltharion's voice carried something almost like envy. You let something in. Yes, Corvin said, another beat. Veltharion stepped back, 1 step, which was all it took, because the 12 in the corridor took their cue from him and moved, clearing the passage in silence, leaving the stone corridor empty except for Corvin and Isadora and Serenia and the 2 court guards, who were looking at each other with the expressions of people who had expected a fight and received instead a masterclass in Covenant law. Serenia said, to no one in particular, I have been navigating this court for 400 years, and I have never seen that clause used. It has not been used since 1902, Isadora said. There was a case in Vienna. Serenia looked at her. You researched 1902 Vienna Covenant cases. I researched every Covenant case involving human civilians and ley line transfers going back to 1600. It took about 8 days. 8 days, Serenia repeated, and then she laughed, which was a sound like breaking crystal, startling and beautiful. Corvin, she is extraordinary. Corvin had not moved. He was still standing where he had been, in the corridor, looking at Isadora with that unguarded expression that had appeared and disappeared the night before, except that this time it was not going anywhere. Serenia, he said, without looking away from Isadora, take the guards and secure the exit. Serenia said nothing, but the sound of footsteps moving away suggested she had complied. She was. Isadora had come to understand, deeply fond of Corvin in the ancient, complicated way that centuries-long friendship produced, and she had also been watching the 2 of them for 3 weeks, with the focused satisfaction of someone who was rooting for an outcome. The corridor was quiet. Corvin stepped toward her, and then stopped, with the careful deliberateness that she recognized as him managing something that wanted to be less careful. You transferred the binding rights, my court, he said. Yes. That is a permanent transfer. Covenant law does not reverse binding decisions of that kind. I know, you cannot undo it. I know, Corvin. I read the statute. It ties you to my court's legal structure indefinitely. In practical terms, it means I am formally connected to your court under covenant law, and you are formally responsible for the ley line and therefore for me, and you cannot divest either of those things. Yes, I understand. I wrote the filing. She paused. I did it on purpose. The silence that followed was full of something she could feel the shape of, even if she could not yet name it. Why? He asked. And the question was so simple and so direct and so unlike his usual armored phrasing that it opened something in her chest. Because I did not want to go back, she said. Not to the version of my life before the alley. Not to not knowing that this world existed. And not, she held his gaze, to not knowing you. Corvin was close enough now that she had to look up, and she was aware of the cool, present reality of him. 8 centuries of survival and loss and chosen isolation, all of it condensed into this masked man who had put himself between her and everything dangerous for 3 weeks, not because it was his function, but because he could not seem to help it. I have spent a very long time, he said, not letting things matter. I know. It does not. It is not a skill I have maintained well recently, I noticed. His hand came up slowly, deliberate in the way that all his deliberate things were, and his fingers touched her jaw, cool and light, and she felt it everywhere. You could have died in that corridor, he said, or in the gallery, or in the alley 3 weeks ago. You walked into a blood law proceeding as a human civilian against one of the oldest living vampires in the northern courts, and you won by citing a 1902 Vienna precedent, 1901, technically. The ruling was issued in 1902, but the case originated in 1901. Something broke open in his expression then, fractured through by something warm and helpless and entirely unpracticed, and he said, quiet and certain, Isadora. Yes, she said, before he could say whatever careful thing he had been preparing. Yes to whatever comes after that. Yes to all of it. He kissed her the way he did everything, with absolute attention and complete presence. And she felt the reality of him in a way that had nothing to do with danger or protection or politics, only with the plain and complicated fact of 2 people who had found each other in the wrong kind of circumstances and made something right out of it anyway. When they separated, his forehead rested against hers, and she could feel him breathing, which he did not strictly need to do but chose to, which she found she loved about him. I thought, he said quietly, that nothing could touch this anymore. The part of me that. He stopped, tried again. I had decided that grief was the cost of caring, and I had accepted the cost by not paying it. I was very certain about this. How certain are you now? Considerably less, he said. She smiled. Good. The aftermath was long, as aftermaths always were, and full of the specific logistics of having restructured a centuries-old covenant alignment in a stone corridor at 2 in the morning. Veltharion did not disappear, because old things with old grudges and old power did not simply dissolve because they had lost a round, but he withdrew, and the withdrawal was formal and documented and witnessed in ways that gave the Covenant Council's enforcement body something to work with. Corvin called in his 6 proxy votes and spent the next 48 hours in formal session with the Covenant body, pressing for a full review of the Noctua Collective's court status. It was not a fast process. It was, he explained to Isadora on the 2nd evening of sessions, not meant to be fast, because fast justice in courts this old tended to produce martyrs rather than corrections. What he was building was structural, the kind of case that would take Veltharion's operational capacity apart piece by piece through legal mechanisms rather than confrontation, which was slower but permanent. Isadora spent those 48 hours in the lower court's archive, because she had found in the Westbrook documents something she had not expected. A 3rd layer beneath the ley line binding and the collective's involvement. A set of original deeds from 1743 that suggested the Westbrook family's connection to the ley line was not accidental. It had been deliberate. Her ancestor, a woman named Harriet Westbrook, had entered a formal agreement with a vampire court of that period to steward the ley line in exchange for protection during a period of significant instability. She brought this to Corvin on the evening of the 2nd day. He read through it, and she watched his expression move through surprise into something that looked like wonder. "Harriet Westbrook," he said. "You knew her." He looked up. "I attended the agreement signing. It was conducted by a court called the Cerevane, which has not existed for 200 years. Harriet Westbrook was," he paused. "She was extraordinary, remarkably intelligent. She came to the signing alone, which no one expected, and she negotiated terms that the Cerevane's own legal body had not anticipated." He looked back at the documents, then at Isadora, with an expression that was equal parts amusement and something tender. "It appears this runs in the family. I come from a long line of women who do not wait to be protected," Isadora said. "I am beginning to understand this." The Covenant session produced 3 outcomes over the following week. The Noctua collective was placed under formal review with asset restrictions pending the investigation of the fraudulent contract. Veltharion was issued a Covenant injunction that restricted his court's operational activities to their registered jurisdiction, and the Westbrook ley line was formally registered under Corvin's court protection, with Isadora listed as the human steward of record, a designation that had not existed in active use for 200 years, and that Thessaly appeared to find both irregular and deeply satisfying. Isadora returned to the surface world with a legal team and 6 weeks of forensic accounting work ahead of her to fully unravel her father's estate from the collective's interference. She did not return to the version of her life that had existed before the alley. That life was a different shape, and she had become a different shape in the 3 weeks that had changed everything, and she was not interested in pretending otherwise. Corvin came to her office. He came in the evening, because the lower court's protocols had specific sunlight management structures that meant his movement between the surface and the underground was timed, and evening was optimal. And he came with the particular quality of intentionality that meant he had been thinking about coming for some time before he actually came. Her office was on the 32nd floor of a building in the financial district, and the city spread out behind her desk in all its lit, indifferent enormity. He stood at the window and looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things he had known for a very long time and was seeing freshly. "I have been thinking," he said, about what it means to accept something permanently." He turned from the window. "The binding transfer was an elegant legal solution. It is also a permanent entanglement. I want to be certain you understand that the entanglement is that I am not merely a legal framework you have attached yourself to. I know you are not a legal framework. I am." He stopped. There was something in his expression that was effortful, the way fluent speakers of a language looked when trying to say something they had not practiced. "I am not easy. I have been alone for a very long time, and I have built my life around certainties that are going to need to shift, and I will sometimes get that wrong. I am not a simple thing to be attached to, Corvin," she said gently. "I am an heiress managing a $2 billion estate in active legal conflict with a vampire court, and I just spent 3 weeks restructuring covenant law by citing 19th century Vienna precedents. I am not looking for simple." He looked at her. The window light fell across his white hair and pale features and silver eyes, and he was beautiful in the way he had always been beautiful since the night in the alley, the kind of beauty that did not require any adjustment to see. It simply was, enormous and cool and entirely itself. "I want you to stay," he said, "not in the legal sense, not in the protection designation sense. I want you in my life, Isadora. Whatever that looks like in practical terms, whatever accommodation we have to make between your world and mine." A pause. "I have not said that to anyone in 211 years." She stood up from her desk and crossed the room to him, and she took his face in her hands, which was, she had learned, a form of contact he had not had much of, the kind of uncalculated physical tenderness that did not mean anything except itself. "Then I will stay," she said, "in all the ways that includes." He covered her hands with his, and for a long moment they simply stood there with the city behind the glass and the old dark world beneath it, and the particular peace of 2 people who had found each other through something terrible and come out the other side, choosing to remain. He kissed her again, and this one was different from the corridor, quieter and more deliberate, with the specific texture of something being decided rather than declared. And she kissed him back with everything she was, the forensic accountant and the heiress and the woman who who had walked into a vampire court, alone with a filing and won, and the person who had known almost from the beginning that the silver-eyed man who had kept her safe had been keeping himself from something equally important which was being known. The months that followed were complicated in the specific way that good things were complicated. Isadora rebuilt the Westbrook estate's finances with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything, and she built it better than it had been before, because she now understood the full architecture of what she was working with, including the ley line and its value and the careful stewardship that genuine protection of it required. She hired an attorney who specialized in covenant law, a human woman named Petra who had discovered the world the same way Isadora had, through a crisis that left no room for disbelief, and who approached it with the brisk competence of someone who had decided that if the world was going to be larger than expected, she was going to learn its full extent. The Noctua Collective's review stretched into a formal dissolution preceding by the spring. Veltharion did not disappear gracefully, because graceful disappearance was not, in the nature of things that had outlasted every consequence they were supposed to fear, but he was diminished, operationally and politically, in ways that were systematic and irreversible. The 6 proxy votes Corvin held produced a covenant amendment that tightened the regulations around human-adjacent binding transfers so thoroughly that the specific mechanism the collective had used on Edmund Westbrook could not be replicated. Serenia attended the amendment signing, and afterward appeared in Isadora's office with a bottle of something that was not wine but that looked like wine, and tasted like what wine would taste like if it had been dreamed rather than grown. And she said, the last time the covenant was amended was 40 years ago. The time before that was 1956. You have been here for 4 months. 6 months, Isadora corrected. Serenia raised her glass. 6 months. And you have rewritten the blood law, settled the ley line question, dismantled Veltharion's operational structure, and made Corvin Mordaine look at something with hope in his eyes for the first time since before I knew him. She paused. I knew him in 1654. That is a long time. He was already old when I met him, Serenia said, already encased in all those centuries of choosing to be alone. I thought it was permanent. I thought he had simply become that. She looked at Isadora with the direct ancient gaze that Isadora had learned to receive without looking away. You found the door in the wall. He left it unlocked, Isadora said. Serenia smiled, and it was the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize the rare things when they appeared. He did, she agreed. He was waiting for someone to notice. On a Saturday evening in December, when the city was cold and bright and full of the particular energy of a world that did not know it was sitting on centuries of hidden history, Corvin took Isadora to the gallery where the knife had been at her throat and the portrait of him hung on the wall. He had not explained why they were going. She had learned not to require explanations in advance. The gallery was private. It had always been private, a place in his building that was separate from the court spaces, separate from the operational rooms where covenant politics happened. It was full of art from every century he had been alive, and she had spent time in it over the months, looking at paintings and asking questions about their contexts, because every piece in this room was a primary source document, and she could not resist primary source documents. He stood in front of the portrait and looked at it the way he sometimes looked in mirrors, with the particular expression of someone confronting the distance between who they had been and who they were. This was painted in 1847, he said. The artist was a human woman. She spent 3 months in this court on a residency that she had negotiated herself, because she had heard about the court and wanted to paint what she found. He paused. She told me I looked like I was waiting for something. Isadora looked at the portrait. The silver eyes in paint looked out from the canvas with the same quality of banked attention that the real ones carried, but the woman had caught something else in them too, something that was almost question, almost longing, almost reach. She was right, Isadora said. She was right, he agreed. He turned to her. I spent time thinking about what I would like to offer you, he said, and his voice had the particular quality of something carefully prepared, which on him meant something prepared for a long time, because careful preparation was what he did when something mattered enough to risk getting it wrong. I am not what I can offer is not conventional. I cannot grow old with you in the usual sense. I cannot promise you the kind of future that progresses in the way you would expect a future to progress. I know. What I can offer is everything I am for as long as you want it. My court, my protection, my life, such as it is. My full attention, which I have not given anything in a very long time and which I intend to give only to you. He reached into his coat and produced something small and old, a ring that was not flashy but was intricate, silver set with a stone that was the precise color of his eyes. And I can offer you this if you will take it. Not as a covenant instrument, not as a blood law designation, as what it is. A man asking a woman, very sincerely, to remain. Isadora looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about the alley in November, and the boardroom, and the lower court, and the corridor, and all the accumulated evidence of who this man was, which was extraordinary, difficult, protective to the point of occasionally unreasonable, deeply honorable in ways that he sometimes disguised as practicality, genuinely incapable of performing indifference he did not feel, and in possession of the most profound capacity for attention she had ever encountered, which he had been pointing at her for 6 months, with increasing openness and decreasing inability to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Yes, she said. Corvin, the answer is yes. He put the ring on her finger with the same focused care with which he did everything. And then he gathered her hands into his and held them the way he held important things, with complete attention and nothing else. Outside the gallery windows, the city moved and breathed and conducted its enormous ordinary life. Beneath it, the lower court hummed with the complex ongoing business of a world that most people would never see. And in the long, careful history of Corvin Mordaine, in all 800 years of accumulated surviving and deliberate isolation and practiced grief, this was the moment that would later be marked as the dividing line. Before and after, she was not his salvation in any dramatic sense. She had not cured him or repaired him or arrived as a correction to a broken thing. What she had done was simpler and more fundamental. She had looked at him fully, with all her intelligence and all her attention, and she had decided he was worth knowing. And she had kept deciding it every day in the face of everything that was difficult and dangerous and complicated about who he was. And he, who had believed for 2 centuries that the capacity in him for this kind of thing was simply gone, had discovered that it had been waiting, as the painter in 1847 had somehow known, for the right person to walk into the alley. The right person had walked in carrying forensic accounting files and an iron spine and a near photographic memory for obscure covenant law, and she had proceeded to dismantle every assumption he had made about what was still possible for him, not with magic or ancient vow or blood law, but with the particular force of a human woman who had looked at an ancient vampire and decided against all reasonable expectation and with full knowledge of everything it entailed, that he was worth staying for. She had proved it in corridors and courtrooms and quiet offices and a gallery at midnight, and she would go on proving it the way she proved everything, methodically and completely, with her whole attention on the work. He pulled her close, and she went, and the ring was cool on her finger, and the city was bright outside, and the world was full of hidden darkness that they both knew exactly how to navigate. They had saved each other, she thought, in the complicated reciprocal way that real saving actually worked. Not rescues, not intervention. Just 2 people deciding, over and over, to face the same direction. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and it was very quiet and very good.